And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is August the 17th, 229th day of this year. Just 136 days remain to the year is over with, and we'll start a new one. It has a number of interesting historical events on this date. 1807, Robert Fulton started the first successful American steamboat service up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany. 1945, Indonesia declared its independence from the Netherlands. And in 1999, a massive magnitude 7.4 earthquake hit Izmit, Turkey, causing widespread destruction and loss of life. And we've got more earthquakes now. Well, we're going to see what stories we have in the news because there's always something going on. The lot of unusual deaths in Hollywood. Hayden Panettiere died at just 36 years old. Circumstances surrounding her death are not immediately made available to the media. The New York native began acting at a young age, cast in One Life to Live when she was just 4 years old. Found fame with a starring role alongside Denzel Washington in the 2000 classic Remember the Titans. She's 15. But she remembered being offered happy pills, and her addiction to opioids and alcohol began. Very attractive young lady. Unfortunately, she had to die at an early age. They were going to make her peppy during interviews, she said. She had no idea this was not an appropriate thing to do or what door would open for her when it came to her addiction. Her career skyrocketed. She was drinking, taking opioids. As she got older, the drugs and alcohol became something she couldn't live without. Published her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, opened up about why she gave full custody of her daughter Kaya to her ex-fiancé, Waldemir Klitschenko. Revealed her 11-year-old daughter has lived with her father since 2018. Well, Iran is at it again. It thrust Diego Garcia into the spotlight as officials call a U.S. military base there integral to the war effort. An official with the self-described Chagosian government in exile said Sunday that war with Iran has underscored Diego Garcia's strategic importance to U.S. forces and Middle East regional stability. The Pentagon shifting logistics to the remote UK-U.S. base in the Indian Ocean after an Iranian strike on a major American installation in Bahrain. And the base in the southern Chagos Archipelago has reportedly supported the carrier strike groups, including the USS Abraham Lincoln, whose forces have conducted air operations and helped enforce the blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. military's wartime logistics network now stretches across roughly 2,200 miles. That's the maritime supply route Diego Garcia allows forces to avoid coastal facilities vulnerable to Iranian attacks, but requiring longer shuttle runs and slower replenishment, according to the New York Times. It's certainly inconvenient. And let's see. Historic Smithsonian Museum packed with woke political messaging on race and gender. As the Smithsonian continues to face scrutiny over its leftward drift, a Fox News digital tour of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History revealed exhibits that present the nation's past through the lens of oppression of minority groups. Maybe nowhere at the museum was that more important and apparent than in the popular entertainment nation exhibit. Series of installations may focus mainly on sports and television and music was a ubiquitous hotbed of woke history. Woke is one of the worst things to happen to this country. One display focuses on the 2010 Lost Suns protest, which features a special basketball jersey worn by a Phoenix Suns player during the protest. In solidarity with the Phoenix community, the Phoenix Suns basketball team challenged Arizona's new immigration law on the court, according to the headline of a placard explaining the display. 2010 Arizona empowered police to question anyone on their immigration status, in effect targeting any Spanish-speaking person with brown skin, according to the placard. Adding, the professional team described the state's new law as a violation of our basic principles of equal rights and protection under the law. Mannequin head displayed the hijab worn by the first Muslim woman to win a major ice skating competition while wearing a religious head covering. Another display links a 2014 X-Men movie to the Black Lives Matter movement, which sparked during the summer of that year. Well, if they're not happy, there's the door. The WNBA fan subreddit bans posters from using Sophie Cunningham's name after the defense of women's sports. The WNBA and its fans are in a constant struggle to outdo whatever previous record they already set for the most ridiculous sports league ever created. Despite their best efforts and hard work, the WNBA has seen its popularity and general interest increase in recent years, thanks primarily to Caitlin Clark. Clark, who single-handedly brought ratings and attendance up to the point where the players now receive significantly better salaries and travel benefits, is widely disliked across the league by many fans of other teams. Then over the last few weeks and months, the self-destructive tendencies and nature of the WNBA organization, its coaches and fans, has reared its head again. This time its ire has been directed against Sophie Cunningham. And what did she do to deserve this treatment? She made comments publicly supportive of keeping male athletes out of women's sports, a position shared by 80 to 90% of the American public and 0% of the league's players, coaches, or officials. They're preparing for weeks and months of meetings to try and decide on a definition of the word woman, which seems to baffle everybody involved in the WNBA. Well, for some reason, my system keeps stopping. Well, the Haley Stevens is urging El Sayed to ditch Hassan Piker affiliation after the Michigan primary. The Representative Haley Stevens, Democratic in Michigan, urged Democratic Senate nominee Abdul El Sayed, who defeated her in Michigan's fierce Democratic primary election, to sever ties with controversial far-left streamer Hassan Piker on the Sunday briefing, saying the party's nominee should now turn his attention toward Michigan voters as he pivots to the general election. Stevens maintained her primary season criticism of Piker, even while backing El Sayed, described herself as still committed to the party. Well, that's what we need to do, is put more Muslims in office. Well, it's not the economy, stupid. Americans vote based on their personal economy. Every election season, politicians suddenly become economists. Start talking about GDP and inflation rates and job creation and trade deficits and economic growth. They point to charts showing why the economy is doing better or worse depending on which party is holding the microphone. There's just one problem. Most Americans don't live their lives on a government spreadsheet, job reports, GDP data, or CPI index information. They live at the grocery store, at the gas pump, live with when the mortgage payment comes out of their checking account, live with the credit card bill. And they live it with their kids asking, can we afford that? Bill Clinton's successful 1992 presidential campaign, strategist James Carville famously posted the message, "It's the economy, stupid," as a reminder to keep the campaign focused on what mattered to the voters. And more than 30 years later, That famous line needs an update. It's not the economy, stupid. It's your personal economy that matters. And we'll see this front and center as a runaway number one issue in the midterms. And unfortunately, for a lot of Americans, the economy is becoming more and more important. Rob Snyder leans on faith and hope for a reconciliation with his estranged daughter, Ellie King. His relationship with his estranged daughter may be strained, but he has hope for the future. Snyder, who's 62, admitted on Andrew Gold's Heretics podcast, "I'll always be there for the talented country singer despite challenges with the past." The grown-ups actor recalled a previous public appearance where he admitted he wasn't the dad that his daughter needed. He said he wasn't prepared emotionally for the outpouring or what I received after that, he said. There's an endemic, and I don't know if it's other cultures, but in the U.S., an endemic of kids who went off to college and came back and said, my daughter doesn't want a relationship with me anymore, or I can't see my grandkids. It's an attack on the culture in a way that the culture is vulnerable. And the unfortunate thing is, shows no signs of getting any better. Well, Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, the rivalry gets a new chapter in the fever dream overtime thriller. Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese gave the WNBA an overtime thriller Sunday evening at State Farm's Arena. Clark scored 26 points, but hit two enormous free throws late in overtime and grabbed the game-ending rebound as the Indiana Fever beat Reese in the Atlanta Dream 95-91. It was a real team win for the Fever, but Clark and Reese were right in the middle of the biggest moments, including Reese's missed layup at the end of regulation that sent the game into overtime. Indiana had to earn it, too. The Fever trailed by 8 after Atlanta scored 28 points in the third quarter to open a 72-64 advantage, but for a team known for its offensive firepower, Indiana's defense, it made the clutch plays down the stretch. The Fever had the Dream to 9 points in the fourth, outscored Atlanta 17-9, and forced overtime. It was the lowest fourth quarter scoring output for the Dream this season, but it almost didn't matter. Well, I will say the WNBA, in spite of its issues, does have some very good players, though there's now question about, or several of them actually males in disguise. The Long Island street takeover erupted as drivers blocked the roads and performed donuts and burnouts, according to the police. 15 people are arrested and 7 vehicles are impounded after police descended on an alleged street takeover that brought reckless driving, donuts, and burnouts to a Long Island roadway early Saturday. Suffolk County Police Department said its street takeover task force got wind of the planned gathering through intelligence gathering and social media monitoring ahead of Friday night, August 14th. Investigators learned the group was preparing to stage a takeover somewhere in Suffolk County, an area covering roughly 1,000 square miles across the eastern two-thirds of Long Island. Police tracked the group as it moved between several locations throughout the night and eventually broke up the attempted gathering near Comic Road and Sunrise Highway in Islip before disrupting another near Route 112 and Main Street in Patchogue. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Police finally intercepted the crowd about 12:50 in the morning on Saturday near Woodside Avenue and Sawgrass Drive in Medford, where authorities said numerous vehicles had effectively shut down the roadway. Police said numerous vehicles effectively closed the roadway on Sawgrass Drive by driving recklessly, performing stunts on the roadway, and doing donuts and burnouts. I don't see what the purpose is, but apparently some folks live for doing things like that. Well, Sam's Club has a meals kit that feeds a family for under $16 as shoppers seek affordable dinners. Families look for ways to keep dinner costs down. Warehouse clubs are competing for shoppers with prepared meals that offer an alternative to cooking from scratch or spending money on takeout. And then prepared meal options at Sam's Club's members marked chicken shawarma kit, 37-ounce mule listed for just under $16 on the retailer's website. The offer is part of a broader push by the Warehouse Club to give members more convenient options for putting dinner on the table, Sam's Club spokesman said. We don't go back there anymore because they do not protect their customers. We had a guy actually try to get violent because he was invited to go ahead of us going in the door. And the next day, he showed up at a gas station I used to go to most mornings and wanted to get feisty. He had a bit of a surprise because I was prepared for idiocy. And let's see, an ex-ABC correspondent admits the network was liberal, claimed nobody there voted for President Trump. Former ABC News correspondent Tony Moran admitted on Friday his longtime network was liberal and struggled to understand President Trump's supporters because this newsroom lacked political viewpoint diversity. Co-host of the Fifth Column podcast, Michael Monahan, asked Moran directly, is ABC News a liberal institution? And he said, yes, but I think like a lot of mainstream media it's because of lack of viewpoint diversity. And that's one of the problems in covering Trump. Nobody had voted for him, so they didn't understand what he had to say. Moran said he attempted to challenge the prevailing newsroom perspective by circulating internal messages about the network's Trump coverage. He said, I sent out these, hey, we should be fair to Trump internal emails, and I heard from people, engineers, maybe the occasional producer, who said thank you. ABC News staffer told Fox News Digital after Moran's departure, veteran correspondent had clashed internally with liberal colleagues, but his social media posts left the network with no other option. It was just sad, honestly. Sad for him, a longtime colleague, a friend, a good person, a family man. It's just unfortunate, but there was no alternative, especially in these times. Well, ABC declined to renew Moran's expiring contract after he published a since-deleted post describing Trump and the White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller as world-class haters. The network said the post violated its policies and reaffirmed its commitment to impartial reporting. If you ever listen to ABC, there is no impartiality about it. Well, from New York to Texas, states should respect local control on data centers. There are nearly 4,600 data centers in the U.S. and thousands more in the world. And a lot of them are in the works as well. In 2025, companies spent almost $400 billion on U.S.-based data centers, with spending trending even higher this year. From New York to Texas, the backlash is glowing. Leading the nation, read a sign on the podium as New York Democrat Governor Kathy Hochul introduced a statewide moratorium on hyperscale data centers. Texas followed on August 3rd. Republican Governor Greg Abbott announced a pause on new data center grid connections until state agencies can audit the projects. At least 14 other states are considering similar actions, including Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even Virginia, whose northern suburbs are data center capital of the world. These misguided efforts seek to protect residents from data centers by ensuring they miss out on the benefits. Communities that excluded canals and railroads in the 19th century often found themselves bypassed by new economic activity. And there's some question about whether or not the electrical grid can handle an influx of data centers. Well, maker of ice cream sold at grocery stores nationwide files for bankruptcy. It's appealing a $23.8 million judgment. Rebel Creamery ended Chapter 11 after nearly $23,900 million reported liabilities. It's in Utah. It reported approximately $18.78 million in assets and $23.85 million in liabilities. It appeals a $23.785 million judgment awarded to rival Van Leeuwen Ice Cream in a trade dress dispute. Rebel Ice Cream sold at Walmart and Kroger and Safeway and a number of other grocery stores nationwide. filed for Chapter 11 protection August 14th in U.S. bankruptcy court for the District of Utah, according to court records. Van Leeuwen is listed among Rebel's unsecured creditors with a $23.785 million claim stemming from the federal judgment. Rebel listed the claim as disputed and noted that the judgment is under appeal. The Van Leeuwen judgment accounts for nearly all the unsecured liabilities Rebel listed at fixed amounts in its bankruptcy schedules. The company also reported about $5.22 million in cash and cash equivalents, $2.59 million in accounts receivable, and $5.65 million in inventory. Well, we're seeing a lot of companies facing some of the same problems. Well, American Pie star Shannon Elizabeth swears off dating, says OnlyFans is the only relationship I need. She isn't looking for another slice of romance anytime soon. Her divorce was finalized in May. She's sworn off dating, insisting OnlyFans is the only relationship she needs. During an appearance with Bill Maher's Club Random podcast, they asked her what's the dating scene like in Cape Town. She moved to South Africa in 2016 to focus on wildlife conservation, which you have to wonder about, let me tell you. She said, I'm very newly single and I don't plan on ever dating again, to be honest. Maher insisted, you going to date? And she said, no. And Maher said, no, not even dating. She said, I don't want to date. I'm not interested. Too many con artists out there. Too many people I don't trust. I just don't have an interest in a relationship I need. The relationships on OnlyFans that I'm building with all these people, she said. And Maher, of course, was adamant that her ban on dating wouldn't stick. Well, we'll see what happens. But to uproot your life for something like conservation and go across the world is, quite frankly, kind of silly. Well, Mangione's federal guilty plea is a tactical effort by the defense, according to an attorney. We'll see what comes of it. Hakeem Jeffries rejects Medicare for all, the DSA agenda, as Ro Khanna calls health plans' most important priority. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, rejected support for Medicare for all and the Democratic Socialist of America's agenda Sunday, saying Democrats should prioritize affordability as they seek to recapture the House in November after a wave of progressive primary victories. Meet the Press host Kristen Welker asked Jeffries directly whether he personally supported Medicare for all. He said, no, as you indicated, I haven't sponsored the Medicare for all legislation over the last few years. I do think we need to figure out how to fix our broken healthcare system and to build something better once we repair the damage that's been done. He also said, as the Democratic leader in the House, it's not legislation he supported, while also reiterating he wanted to find a path to fix the healthcare system and make healthcare affordable for every single American. So let's bring in communism and socialism. That's always good for a fix. Well, Russell Fry endorses ex-rival Darlene Graham after failing to advance the special GOP U.S. Senate primary runoff. That's in South Carolina. He's the candidate that placed third in the August 11th South Carolina special Republican U.S. Senate primary. He's endorsed top finisher Senator Darlene Graham, Republican of South Carolina. He said during a Friday post on X, President Trump needs fighters and allies in the Senate who will show up every day and get results. I think Darlene Graham would do exactly that. Darlene knows what it means to struggle, persevere, and keep fighting when life deals you a difficult hand. These experiences shaped, and I believe they gave her a real understanding of the challenges families across South Carolina face. Well, she's the sister of Lindsey Graham, so she does have some experience in the political realm. Well, in our last show, we talked about Jack the Ripper's forgotten victims. There's what's known as the Canonical Five, the 5 people Jack the Ripper supposedly killed. And yet there's evidence he killed a lot more. It's just that in order to keep folks from panicking, the other deaths were downplayed. The East End of London was a very dangerous place. It still is, even when I was there in '89. The Another little known victim was named Annie Millwood. She died February 25th, 1888. Now, the winter of 87-88 was a harsh and unrelenting event right across Europe. Some parts of Britain, snow reached a record depth of 24 inches. And in the U.S., snowstorms paralyzed the East Coast and killed over 400 people in what became known as the Great Blizzard. Well, Saturday, February 25th, 1888, was another cold day. Dark skies and dirty rain made the streets even grayer and gloomier, dulling the mind and depressing the spirit. Just before 5 p.m., Annie Millwood turned up at the imposing, forbidding Whitechapel Infirmary on Baker's Row. It wasn't clear whether she was brought there or got there of her own accord, but she'd been stabbed several times. She battled pain and exhaustion as she tried to make it to medical care. According to the admissions register at the infirmary, she was 38 years old, the widow of a soldier named Richard Millwood. The East Post and City Chronicle reported she'd been stabbed with a clasp knife in the legs and lower part of the body by a man she didn't know. The admissions register showed she was admitted from 8 Wright's Row, a common lodging house, also known as the Fiddlefield Chambers. Don't know if that was where the attack took place, if that was where she lived, if it was just a sanctuary where she was taken to receive medical aid. In fact, we don't know much at all about this attack except that nobody saw it. And no newspaper at the time is known to have cared to report about it. All we know comes from a few details given in a couple of East End newspapers a month later, after she died, for medical problems unrelated to the attack. And that was when the inquest was held. It's generally accepted serial killers like Jack the Ripper don't begin their careers with full-blown murder mutilation. And so researchers have gone through newspapers for stories of assaults and injuries that could have been the work of an embryonic Jack the Ripper. Never be known if Annie Millwood was an early victim of a nascent Jack, but a knife attack focused on the lower torso has certainly got Ripper-like characteristics. Whatever the actual facts, her story does serve to illustrate the sort of casual violence that was common in the East End of London. And East End was rife with common lodging houses like the Spitalfield Chambers, and all the victims of Jack the Ripper lived or had lived in them. These were a poor man's home or hotel where £4, equivalent of about £1 in today's money, could buy a bed for the night. You get a double bed for £8. Use of cooking facilities and the want of a communal kitchen. An outhouse with the usual facilities and somewhere to get washed and to launder your clothes. A lot of lodging houses had also supplied a few basic necessities such as soap, and sometimes you could even buy food there. Governed by various parliamentary acts, among them the Common Lodging Houses Acts of 1851 and 1853, Sanitary Act of 1866, and the Sanitary Law Amendment Act of 1874. Among other things, these specified that the walls and ceilings had to be lime washed in April and October, and the rooms had to be adequately ventilated. Every window in the house had to be thrown open at 10 a.m., and that there had to be a proper water supply. In many ways, this made them preferable to rented rooms that provided a degree of privacy and were cheaper for a family, but which were frequently unsanitary and lacked washing and toilet facilities. Authorities are also greatly concerned with ensuring that good moral standards are maintained in these establishments. So most catered to one sex only, or in a few cases, only for married couples. And there's a widespread belief, somewhat supported by the facts, that a blind eye was turned to prostitutes arriving with their clients, and such lodging houses were consequently viewed as hotbeds of vice and immorality and criminality. Each of these was overseen by a lodging house deputy or a manager who often had an office by the front door. They were supposed to keep an eye on people coming into the house. Metropolitan London, responsibility for ensuring common lodging houses conform to the rules laid down in the Acts, arrested with the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. The police had a legal right to enter and inspect any common lodging house at any point in time. And certainly some will well run. Dickens' Dictionary of London refers to St. George's Chambers in St. George's Street near the London docks as the best example of this kind of establishment in existence, but the lodging houses generally had an evil reputation for dirt and squalor and disease and violence. Montague Williams, the presiding magistrate at Worship Street Police Court, and widely regarded as a friend of the poor, was as likely not to take the side of a working-class complainant against a wealthy or influential opponent. He had often denounced the evils of the common lodging house. 1888, a powerfully built young woman named Mary McCarthy, a notorious character in the area, came up in front of him for stabbing Ann Neeson, the deputy of a Spitalfields lodging house, in the face and neck with a skewer. But the attack was all but forgotten in the courtroom. Williams discovered no effort had been made to establish whether the couple staying at the lodging house were married or not. He said, "Precisely what I thought, and the sooner these lodging houses are taken down, the better. They're the haunt of the burglar, the home of the pickpocket, the hotbed of prostitution. I don't think I can put it stronger than that. And it's time the owners of these places who get large profits from them are taken into account." He said, "As a magistrate, I have made it my business to go over some of these places, and I say that the sooner they're put down, the better. My humble judgment, they're about as unwholesome and unhealthy as well as dangerous to the community as can well be. Places among them where the police don't even dare enter, and that's where the criminal hides all day long." Well, his remarks were quoted in Parliament, and the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, responded, "In the opinion of the police, it can't be said that crime is due to common lodging houses. There's no doubt that a certain number of the criminal class do live in common lodging houses, but the owners of these houses are ready as a rule to assist the police with information. The inmates are under police supervision to a greater extent than they would be if they had to live elsewhere." The Spitalfields Chamber, which was licensed to provide 51 double beds, was owned by a well-known lodging house keeper named William Crossingham. Also had properties neighboring Dorset Street and Paternoster Row. Evidently profited from his businesses, leaving an estate valued at over £11,000 at his death, which was a considerable amount of money in those days. White's Row itself doesn't seem to have had a particularly bad reputation, unlike Dorset Street. In October of 1888, John Henry Stevenson, a rescue officer for an organization known as the Reformatory and Refuge Union, brought a court case concerning 3 children who had been forced to live there with the prostitutes. Said he knew the women to be prostitutes because he had seen them soliciting. He described the lodging house itself as usually a quiet house and indicated he didn't consider it a brothel, rather a place where cohabitation was the normal condition between the inhabitants. However, White's Row may have been troubled by one of the many street gangs in the area. A laborer named John Hall was stabbed in the neck, leaving his left arm permanently paralyzed in a street attack there in November of 1888. A young man named George Birmingham, who was charged with the crime, who was described as a member of the White's Row gang. White's Row also had a number of connections with the Whitechapel murders themselves, leaving aside Annie Millwood. Both Alice Mackenzie and Frances Cole stayed there, and Annie Chapman was staying at one of Crossingham's properties in Dorset Street when she was murdered. Then we got Ada Wilson. Almost a month to the day after the knife attack on Annie Millwood, a similar assault was made on 39-year-old dressmaker named Ada Wilson. It was March 28, 1888. She lived in Maidman Street, an area which once been described as semi-rural, but by 1888 was a typical East End urban jungle. Ran off a relatively new thoroughfare called a Burdett Road, built to connect Mile End Road with the East India Dock Road. Maidman Street would receive a direct hit from a bomb during the Blitz in the Second World War, and the bomb site survived into the 1960s, getting a little publicity in 1959 when it was used by thieves to dump a safe they had stolen. Ada Wilson lived at 19 Maidman Street. 12:30 in the morning on Wednesday, March 28, she answered a knock at the front door. There was a man standing outside, looked to be about 30, 5 foot 6 inches tall, with a fair mustache and a sunburned face as if he'd been abroad, like a soldier or perhaps a sailor. He was described as wearing a trench coat, light trousers, and type of hat known as a wide awake. According to the story, he immediately pushed Ada backwards into the small hallway and threatened to kill her unless she handed over all the money she had. She said she refused, and he took a clasp knife out of his pocket and stabbed her twice in the throat and ran. She screamed and collapsed. At least that's a story she gave to police. Another young woman named Rose Bierman, who shared 2 upstairs rooms with her mother, gave a slightly different version of events to a journalist from the Eastern Post and City Chronicle. According to her story, Ada was married, although she never had seen the husband, and she often had visitors, although she rarely seen them in person. Bierman knew that Ada had returned home that evening with a man, but all had been quiet in the house till she heard the most terrible screams you can imagine. Went to the top of the stairs and looked down and saw Ada partially dressed, wringing her hands and crying. She was screaming, "Stop that man for cutting my throat. He stabbed me," and then she collapsed. Young man then rushed to the front door, opened it, and ran into the street. A couple of young women also heard the screams and gone into the house, where they found Ada lying in the hallway covered in blood, so they went off and got a policeman. 2 constables they tracked down, Ronald Saw and Thomas Longhurst, were on duty outside a pub called the Royal Hotel on the corner of Mile End Road and Burdett Street. They went to the house and found Ada bleeding profusely from a wound in her throat. Policemen immediately sent for Dr. Richard Wheeler, an Irish-born doctor with a practice on the Mile End Road. He couldn't do much but attend to her immediate needs, which he did, and arranged for her to be taken to the London hospital, where she was treated by Dr. William Rawes and afterwards by Dr. John Cooper. Her condition was critical, but she was able to recount what had happened to her. Fortunately for her, she survived and was discharged April 27th. Well, there, of course, are a lot of theories, one being that Wilson had been stabbed by her husband, with whom she had argued. Testimony of Rose Bierman also makes one wonder if Ada's story was even true. According to Rose, Ada had been partially dressed, and would she have answered the door in such a state to a stranger late at night? Bierman's account also suggests that the man was not visible to her from the top of the stairs, but was well inside the house, with Ada positioned between him and the door as if she'd been letting him out, not letting him in. Overall, Wilson's story sounds like a concocted tale to explain why she was alone in her rooms in a state of partial undress with a man. In that case, the true cause of the attack is and will forever remain unknown. It's possible that the attacker was her husband, or he may have been one of her many visitors, which would put a different complexion on her profession. And although 2 detectives were sent to find the attacker, they never did. With Ada recovering in the hospital, Annie Millwood was discharged to the Whitechapel Union Workhouse in Mile End about 11:40 in the morning on March 31st, 1888. She was talking to a workhouse messenger named Richard Sage. He was distracted from their conversation for a few minutes. When he turned back, he found Annie had collapsed. The master of the workhouse, Thomas Badcock, telephoned the infirmary and summoned Dr. Wheeler from his surgery. When the doctor arrived, he found that Annie was already dead from a sudden effusion into the pericardium from the rupture of the left pulmonary artery. Well, of course, the stories about the Whitechapel murders make much about the coroner, Win Baxter. An inquest into the death of Annie Millwood was held at the infirmary in Baker's Row on Thursday, April 5th, 1888. The coroner for East Middlesex, Win Baxter, presided. And quite often, the coroners, who were generally elected, were not, shall we say, the epitome of medical science. The jury recorded a verdict of death from natural causes, and apart from a couple of short reports of the inquest in the newspapers, the attack on Annie Millwood was all but forgotten. Win Baxter, W-I-N-N-E, Baxter, would go on to become one of the most important figures in the history of the Whitechapel murders, presiding over the inquest into the deaths of Annie Millwood and Emma Smith and Martha Tabram and Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman and Elizabeth Stride, Rose Milett, Alice McKenzie, the Pigeon Street Torso, and Francis Coles. But Baxter has never been remembered fondly or kindly, the late Tom Cullen typifying how he was long perceived. Cullen wrote that Baxter conceived it his mission in life to expose the stupidities of the law guardians. Indeed, the police became so incensed at his carping criticism and insinuations that the inquest into one of the Ripper murders was taken out of his hands, even though the murder had occurred inside his bailiwick as coroner. Now, the stories about Baxter were relatively unfair. It's difficult to assess a man's personality from limited biographical information, especially when the main source is obituaries, which tend to smooth the rough edges of a man's character and emphasize his personal qualities and achievements. But the perception of Baxter as a fussy, pedantic man who was a thorn in the side of the police is almost certainly wrong. Now, Baxter, a little bit of history about Baxter. Born in 1844 in the town of Lewes in Sussex, son of the proprietor and editor of the Sussex Express, educated at Lewes Old Grammar School, he called to the bar in 1867, practiced as a solicitor in Lewes, where he was appointed coroner for Sussex in 1876. By 1885, he was deputy coroner for the city of London and the borough of Southwark. Then in December of 1886, he was elected coroner for East Middlesex. Now, the election was something of an extraordinary affair. It was snowing on Friday, December 10th. Gave London a wintry Christmas card appearance until the sun melted the snow. The election proceedings at Vestry Hall and Burnell Green were, as the Times reported, of a very disorderly character, owing to a mob of roughs having by some means gained admission to the hall. Several fights took place among them, and they hissed and hooted indiscriminately. One incident even ended up in court. William Upton, claiming an estate agent named Ephraim Brooks, grabbed him by the throat, almost strangled him in an effort to prevent him from getting in to vote. According to Upton, the roughs trying to gain entry were known as Baxter's Lambs. Gangs would be paid to go in and dominate the voting procedures. Under the law, any freeholder was entitled to vote, but all that was required was the word of the voter he owned property. And since there was no proper definition in the law at the time of a freeholder, many of those who voted did so on the basis of owning something as small as a burial plot. Eventually, Mr. George Young was elected on a show of hands, which was a huge surprise since a tight contest had been expected between Baxter and Dr. Roderick MacDonald. Finally, it was decided that the disorder had been so great the precise number of votes cast couldn't be properly ascertained, and a fresh election was going to be held the following Monday. Again, a large number of roughs managed to gain entry to the vestry hall and got into fights. Police had a great difficulty in keeping the peace. At the conclusion of the election, one of the candidates, Mr. Beard, hinted very broadly no small amount of bribery and corruption had been used. All in all, the election was a farce, giving opportunity for the greatest of abuses. Eventually, though, the votes were actually counted. Baxter got 1,401, MacDonald 1,069, Young got 696, Beard got 254, Dr. Porter got 55. The next year, 1887, Baxter presided over the inquest into the death of Miriam Angel. She was murdered at 16 Batty Street in East End by an immigrant Jew named Israel Lipsky. The case remained a minor cause celebre because it was widely believed at the time that Lipsky was innocent. It was a great campaign, both inside and outside Parliament, for his reprieve. Home Secretary Henry Matthews came under considerable pressure. For his part, he declared, though he entertained not the shadow of a doubt about Lipsky's guilt, and he greeted Lipsky's eventual confession with considerable relief. Lipsky was eventually hung at Newgate Prison, June 29, 1887. Though his motive for confessing has been questioned and his guilt still debated to this day. In 1888, Elizabeth Stride, generally considered to have been murdered by Jack the Ripper, is killed in a street close to Batty Street. A man named Israel Schwartz claimed to have witnessed a woman who he identified as Stride being assaulted just outside the gates leading to a passage where 15 minutes later her body was found. According to Schwartz, the man committing the assault had cried out Lipsky, but what he meant was unclear. Inspector Frederick Abilene volunteered an answer, stating in an official report that since a Jew named Lipsky was hung for the murder of a Jewish in 1887, the name has very frequently been used by persons as a mere ejaculation by way of endeavoring to insult the Jew to whom it had been addressed. Most of the Whitechapel murder cases fell to Baxter because of where they took place, don't you know? He gained undeserved notoriety for advancing the theory that the murders were committed in order to obtain the victim's internal organs. That was one of the theories. In fact, that wasn't his theory at all. It came about because the day after the medical evidence had been given about the murder of Annie Chapman, during which it was revealed the killer had extracted and taken away the uterus, Baxter got a message from the sub-curator of the Pathological Museum at what he described as one of our great medical schools, to the effect that several months earlier an American doctor had been offering to pay £20, which is a considerable sum, for a uterus. Seemingly had planned to give away one with every copy of a publication he was writing. Baxter didn't say he believed this story, nor didn't he suggest the American doctors murdering women for their internal organs, but he did wonder if the story, from how absurd it might sound, had reached and incited some abandoned wretch to possess himself of a specimen. And let me tell you, £20 in those days was a considerable sum of money. Well, this was by no means an outrageous suggestion. Furthermore, as Baxter pointed out, if he had not got the doctor giving evidence to divulge the medical facts, for which he, Baxter, had come in for criticism, he wouldn't have heard from the sub-curator. And that's a valid point, given that one reason for the inquest was to elicit further important information that would aid the police investigation. In fact, the London correspondent for the Chicago Tribune actually wrote about it. He said, "I learned today from a Scotland Yard man working on the case that the mysterious American who was here a few months ago offering money for specimens of the parts taken from the bodies of the victims has been discovered. He was a reputable physician in Philadelphia with a large medical practice. He was in London preparing a medical work on specific diseases. He went to King's College, Middlesex Hospital, and asked for specimens, and said he was willing to pay well if he couldn't get them otherwise. The statement he offered £20 each, or named the other large sum, seems to be a delusion by the coroner. And these facts were given to police by an eminent London physician who saw a great deal of the Philadelphian when he was here, but would only divulge the information on a written guarantee from Sir Charles Warren that neither his name nor the name of the physician in question should be given to the public. He said the doctor had gone back to America and his mission here is purely legitimate. Well, the identity of that Philadelphia physician has never been established. Interestingly, the theory in which Win Baxter may have placed the greatest credence was revealed in an obituary of him published in the Evening News. This stated he attributed the Whitechapel murders to the Fenians, and advanced his theory to the Home Office, who told him he was not alone in his opinion. The possibility there was a Fenian involvement in the Ripper murders lends the crimes a completely new historical dimension. The Fenian Brotherhood was an American organization that had the avowed aim of overthrowing British rule in Ireland. And we do know from other sources that theory may indeed have had a solid factual foundation. In 1956, Douglas Brown published The Rise of Scotland Yard, and it's clear that he had assessed, at the time closed, official files relating to the Whitechapel murders and had found a possible reference to Fenian involvement. According to Brown, a third head of the CID, Sir Melville Macnaghten, appears to identify the Ripper with the leader of a plot to assassinate Mr. Balfour at the Irish office. And that claim is unsupported by any of Macnaghten's existing writings, and Macnaghten himself seems to have considered a barrister and teacher named Montague John Druitt as the prime candidate for being the Ripper. But Brown's claim can't be casually dismissed. Large number of documents have gone missing from the file, so Brown could have got the information from documents no longer existing. Furthermore, it's now known that there were Fenians aspiring to assassinate Balfour. However, how the Jack the Ripper murders could have furthered Fenian ambitions is really not clear. On the eve of Baxter's inquest into the death of Annie Millwood at about 4 in the morning, a woman named Emma Smith staggered into her lodgings with severe internal injuries. Today, she's not generally regarded as having been a victim of Jack the Ripper, but one detective at the time, Walter Dew, believes she actually was. Now, her date of death was April 3rd, 1888. Her name is Emma Elizabeth Smith. The day before Win Baxter sat down to conduct the inquest into the death of Annie Millwood, the authorities at the London hospital informed him as a matter of routine that a woman died at the hospital from injuries sustained in a street assault. Her name was Emma Elizabeth Smith, and according to the story she told a doctor who attended her, she'd been set upon by 3 men, none of whom she knew, one of whom had thrust a hard, blunt object into her nether regions. Her injuries were so severe that she died from them, and the police file was included in the Whitechapel murders file, along with those committed by Jack the Ripper. Easter Monday, April 2nd, 1888, continued to be a miserable day. Temperature in London had not risen above 44 degrees Fahrenheit all day, and as darkness fell, it dropped to just above freezing. And were occasional flurries of sleet or snow to add to the misery for those people walking the streets. Now, Emma Smith needed money. She was 45 years old, about 5'2", light brown hair and a scar on her right temple. She was considered by most people to be a prostitute, almost certainly was an alcoholic and was belligerent when drunk. She often appeared bruised from a brawl or sporting a black eye after being hit by a man, and once somebody had even thrown her through a window. But by some accounts, she had once enjoyed a more prosperous and settled life with a husband and 2 children. Detective Dew would later write about her character in previous life. She was a woman more than 40, something of a mystery. Her past was a closed book even to her most intimate friends. All she'd ever told anybody about herself, she was a widow who had more than 10 years before had left her husband and broken away from all her early associates. Got the hiccups. Something about Emma Smith would suggest it had been a time when the comforts of life hadn't been denied her. Touch of culture in her speech, unusual in her class. Once, when she was asked why she had broken away completely from her old life, she replied they did not understand now any more than they understood then. She said, "I have to live somehow." By the time he wrote those lines, Dew had acquired a sort of celebrity status later reserved for movie stars. He was the policeman who had arrested the murderer Dr. Crippen after a thrilling race across the Atlantic. But at the time of the Whitechapel murders, he was just a young policeman recently transferred to H Division CID. That information about Emma Smith, previous life unknown from any other source, suggests he was actively involved in investigating the murder. It may be significant, therefore, that Dew believed she had actually been murdered by Jack the Ripper. The silence, the suddenness, the complete elimination of clues, the baffling disappearances all go to support the view, which I've always held, that Emma Smith was the first to meet her death at the hands of Jack the Ripper. Dew was writing those words almost half a century after the murder. He can't have anticipated people to one day scrutinize his every word for the slightest nuance. And he was relying on his memory, and occasionally it let him down. For example, he wrote that Emma Smith was found lying unconscious in the street. In fact, after the attack, she managed to get back to her lodgings and went from there to the hospital. But such details may have been unimportant to Dew, who probably considered it of far more significance she had been assaulted in the open and well-frequented thoroughfare, unlike the dark alleys and sinister courts chosen by the Ripper. But according to Dew, it must be remembered if there was a Ripper murder, it was the first. The need for caution wasn't so great. As Dew intimated, little was known about Emma Smith. She'd been married, but most of her newspaper reports stated that she was a widow. Husband had been tentatively identified as John Smith, born in Margate, Kent, and a pensioner of the 35th Royal Sussex Regiment of Foot. He appears in the 1881 census living at 118 Central Street, St. Luke's, together with his wife Emma, born in Plymouth, and 2 children. Emma's age at the time was given as 37, which matches fairly well with the estimated age of Emma Smith in 1888. Also said to have been the mother of 2 children, a boy and a girl, who at the time of her death were living in Finsbury Park in North London with a relative. For the final 18 months of her life, Emma had been living in a common lodging house at 18 George Street, one of a row of mean 3-story tenements connecting the notorious Flower and Dean Street with Wentworth Street. Street with many connections to the Whitechapel murders, usually left the lodging house between 6 and 7 p.m. to find money and alcohol. This inclement Easter Monday evening was no different. According to Mary Russell, the deputy keeper of the lodging house, who claimed to have known her for 2 years, Emma usually returned drunk, and when in drink, she could behave like a mad woman. Violence against women was common in the East End. It's possible that Emma's drunken belligerence could have upset or angered somebody so much that just giving her a black eye wasn't enough. Easter Monday slipped away for another year. Margaret Hayes, who also lived at 18 George Street, saw Emma Smith in Farrant Street, one of the many roads that led off Burdett Road. Hayes was getting out of the area. She'd been badly assaulted just before Christmas 1887, and only minutes earlier had been stopped by 2 men who'd asked her the time before one of them hit her across the mouth. At that point, both of them ran away. There'd been some rough work going on, she stated mysteriously without explaining what she meant by rough work. As she hurried home, she saw Emma talking to a man dressed in dark clothes and a white scarf. It's 12:15 in the morning on Tuesday, April 3rd. At 1:30 a.m., Emma Smith was making her way down Whitechapel Road near Whitechapel Church, which was destroyed in the Second World War. She saw two or three men, one of them a youth aged about 19. They saw her, alarmed her. She apparently crossed the road to avoid them and turned into Osborne Street, which after a short distance merged into Brick Lane. We don't know what it was about the men. It so frightened Emma. She didn't say to anybody. Indeed, Mary Russell's reported as suggesting she seemed unwilling to go into details, but did not describe the men and didn't say what had happened. But later, while being helped to a hospital, she did point out that where the assault had taken place, Object 10 Brick Lane, near Taylor Brothers Mustard and Cocoa Mill, on the corner of Brick Lane and Wentworth Street. She also seems to have been reluctant to go to the police and report the assault, as Inspector Edmund Reed noted in his report. She had passed a number of PCs en route, but none was informed of the incident or asked to render assistance. And how clearly she actually saw her attacker is uncertain, but the assault was brutal. She was knocked to the ground and had something rammed into her, causing severe injuries. Now, the attack took place just 300 yards from her lodgings. Reports suggest she didn't get back until 4 or 5 in the morning. If the time of the assault was even remotely accurate, and it probably was, since Emma would almost certainly have glanced at the Whitechapel church clock, then it took her 2 hours or more to get home. And there are several possible explanations, of course. The timing could be way out. She may have been in so much pain she could only walk extremely slowly, and she could have been left unconscious in the street, assumed to be drunk or sleeping rough by anybody who saw her. In the newspapers and the policeman believed that a man had found her and taken her home. Emma seems to have been so reluctant to discuss what happened she may not have mentioned him, or maybe never thought to do so. Well, she did finally reach 18 George Street, where she was met by Mary Russell, a deputy keeper, Margaret Hayes, and several lodgers, one of whom we know by name Annie Lee. Her face was bleeding, her ear was cut. She was obviously in distress, in need of hospital treatment. We decided to take her to the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, half a mile or so away. She was unwilling to go only because she was in such agony she didn't want to walk, or maybe because she knew she'd be asked questions, or possibly because she simply didn't want to go to the hospital at all. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Now, I will say that going to the hospital was actually a frightening place. Dr. Frederick Threes was a surgical registrar and assistant surgeon at the London Hospital, and later became surgeon and head of the School of Anatomy. Best known today for his association with the tragically deformed Joseph Carey Merrick, who also called Elephant Man, whom he gave a home in the London Hospital. Well, we'll be back tomorrow and talk more about some of the forgotten victims of ubiquitous Jack the Ripper. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.